Thanks very much and good afternoon. With a slightly different approach to what we've had for this morning's part of the seminar, I'm going to be focusing on education and training only, so not research and testing, but education and training. And InterNICHE is an international network, a non-profit NGO based here in Leicester, but with national contacts and partners in around 50 countries across the world. And we're mostly a volunteer-based organisation, working with teachers and with students and campaigners to bring about replacement of harmful animal use in education and training. And by harmful animal use, I'm talking about dissection of purpose-killed animals, animal experimentation, and the use of animals for specific skills training. And I've called the title of the talk Best Practice and Alternatives in Education and Training, because what we're really looking at is teaching objectives and the most effective ways of meeting them using the most advanced and appropriate technology, informed by ethics and issues to do with pedagogics and learning. And I'll give you some examples of this throughout the talk. Now, just to have a look at some of the different types of alternatives that I use within education and training. This here is a training mannequin for spay and neuter. So veterinary students can practice that procedure before they work with the real animal, so they'll be better prepared and will have a better idea of what to expect when they do the actual operation. The next is an app for surgical training to remind yourself about certain procedures. So there's also apps for phones and iPads and so on. You can get simulations of different clinical conditions and different surgical procedures, which you can practice either using just basic DVD or even more advanced virtual reality. This is a model where you can practice clinical skills training within veterinary medicine for large animal procedures. This is a rabbit ear model, so you can practice taking blood and giving injections with the rabbit ear. Next you can see Critical Care Jerry. This isn't Critical Care Jerry, this is Critical Care Jerry. And Jerry's a dog mannequin with a whole range of functionality to practice different procedures, everything from how to approach the animal and chest compressions to intubation, fixing a broken bone, and listening to a wide range of breath and heart sounds on the model as well. And this here, in this case, is connected up with other apparatus so you can practice a wide range of different clinical scenarios in a simulated clinic. This is some external anatomy, some live anatomy. So it's body painting of horses. You can do the same with dogs. So you can look at sort of biomechanics and movement from the anatomical perspective, as this particular DVD demonstrates. And finally here we have a look at a student working under supervision from a professional vet doing an operation. So instead of this being an animal experiment for learning and practicing surgery, this is a situation of the student observing, assisting and then performing the surgery. So in this case it's not about instrumental use of animals, it's about helping an animal patient and learning at the same time. So I'm going to be talking about a few myths and clarifications throughout the talk. First one, this isn't a talk about education about alternatives and training in alternatives for research and testing. No, we're talking about education and training at university and professional level through alternatives, using alternatives, not just about alternatives. Because in this field, education and training comprises the gaining of known knowledge, not new knowledge, and the acquisition of skills, a wide range of different skills and attitudes. So this is the focus of the talk, the focus of the field. There is a connection, of course, between alternatives in education and training and alternatives in research and testing, in terms of familiarity of alternatives, in terms of the critical thinking that alternatives can encourage, and also in terms of avoiding the desensitisation that animal experiments can sometimes bring about. So it impacts to a large degree on research and testing, but the focus is education and training. So what are the different areas where animals are used sometimes, in some countries, in some courses, within education and training? Firstly, anatomy, animals killed for dissection. Secondly, in biochemistry, physiology, pharmacology, preparations made from animals, for example, the frog nerve or frog muscle, to demonstrate physiological principles, and so on. And this is another area where animals might be killed and the preparations taken. Sometimes animals are used when alive as well, for example, acetylcholine on frog heart and so on, and this is also to demonstrate certain principles. Clinical training and surgery is another area where animals are sometimes used in a harmful way. For example, castration, everything from handling to castration to practicing euthanasia or killing. So the relationship when animals are used in a harmful way between the animals and the students or trainees is a negative one. And our work is to try and bring about a transformation so that the relationship is at least neutral, if not positive. So humane education is a progressive education where the teaching objectives are met using humane alternative methods. And teaching objectives is going to be one of the main focuses of the talk, because we're looking at how to gain the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes to become a well-trained professional. Humane education is also an education, of course, where animals are free from harm and students have freedom of conscience, because this is a freedom of conscience issue. And it's also education that encourages compassion, empathy, respect for life and critical thinking skills. And I'll be demonstrating later how critical thinking skills can be encouraged by the use of alternatives and by questioning the orthodoxy of animal experimentation within the field. So what exactly are alternatives in this area? They're educational aids or teaching approaches that can replace harmful use of animals. They can also complement existing humane education. I think that veterinary surgery in Britain is generally learnt in the clinic rather than with animal experiments. So these models and mannequins and simulators can also further add to the quality of the education. But one of our main areas of work is to bring about the replacement using these methods. Another myth, the 3 R's. Now, in education and training, are the 3 R's relevant or not? We argue no. Within the 3 R's themselves, full replacement is the aim. And if full replacement can be achieved, it should be achieved. This is what the 3 R's also is about. But the 3 R's came from a lab animal science perspective, not from a pedagogical perspective. In education and training, it's about knowledge and skills acquisition. It's not about pure research or consumer safety. So it's about knowledge and skills, not about science. So we need to question how relevant the 3 R's really are to education and training. The ideal replacement within the 3 R's is non-animal, but for some zoologists and for all veterinary students, they do in fact need hands-on experience of animals and animal tissues. So we would argue that the perfect replacement may indeed involve animals, but where there's no harmful use of animals. So again, that's another shortcoming of applying the 3 R's to education and training. So I think we need to redefine alternatives and change the mindset. So the feasibility of replacement alternatives in education and training, and you can find examples of where alternatives have fully replaced the experiments in every course, where in another place you might find animals are being discussed as necessary. I think argues that we can claim that the 1 R of replacements is most suitable for education and training. However, we also need to broaden the definition as well as make it stricter to include what we would call ethically sourced animal organs, tissues and cadavers, and also the opportunities for students to be working and trainees to be working within the clinic. So the definition needs to be a little bit broader as well as far as we're concerned within this pedagogical field. We have a policy where all of this is explained in much more detail, looking at all the use of animals and alternatives within education and training. We have a position statement, definitions of alternatives and harm, our policy on dissection, ethical sourcing and other acceptable sources. Looking at live animal use for clinical skills and surgical training, when is it acceptable or not, according to us. And live animal field studies, when is it okay or not, according to us, to work with live animals in the field, for zoologists, for example. So this is where we go into more detail. Oh, and one more, animal use for the production of alternatives as well. That's also an ethical issue. This is how we define harm. Any action that limits the following freedoms. The freedom to live, that's already been touched upon, death as being a significant form of harm. So we think this is a very significant freedom too. And then the other freedoms, some of which you'll recognise from the 5 freedoms from farm animal welfare, but extended a little bit more to also cover full natural behaviour and to be part of a social structure and ecosystem. Now that's a very strict definition of harm and of freedoms, and the question is, can we actually respect all those freedoms and have excellent quality training within medicine, veterinary medicine and biological science education? And I think we can, and that's why we're going to look now at the different types of alternatives. So hopefully you'll agree with me that all the teaching objectives within those courses, within those practical classes, can indeed be met using alternatives. So these are the different types. We have film and video, models, mannequins, simulators, multimedia including virtual reality and haptic technology, ethically sourced animal cadavers, organs and tissues, clinical work with patients, self-experimentation, in vitro labs and field studies. First, film and video. This is a stills image of a dissection of a pigeon. Such professionally performed dissections recorded onto CD and DVD or broadcast can often provide more information than the dissection done by the student himself or herself. It's not hands-on, you don't get hands-on experience, but there are other ways of meeting those specific objectives as well. So this is a very effective way. A video is certainly sufficient for the many students who won't go on to use animals in the future, and is also a valuable single alternative that can be used in combination with others for those students who will work with animals later. Models vary from plastic and wooden models that have been used for a very long time to help illustrate anatomy. You can also plastinate real animals, animals that have died naturally, for example, and where you have the dehydration and the addition of silicone and other materials to make a more or less permanent specimen. For example, at different levels of dissection, different species and so on. So plastination is also another preservation method which can be used, can provide an alternative. And then there's a wide range of different models and mannequins and simulators for the many different clinical skills that need to be learned by human and veterinary medical students. These range from suture pads to injection pads for intramuscular and subcutaneous injections, suture arms where you can do internal and external suturing, different animal models to practice animal handling, intubation, taking blood and giving injections. And many of these models can be connected up with other apparatus, such as anaesthesia, to practice anaesthesia management and so on, or critical care scenarios, trauma management and so on. So there's really a wide range of models. It's a bit hard to see with the lights here, but there is that's the head of Jerry, Jerry's brother, also called Jerry, just for intubation purposes. And of course students can practice and practice and practice again. There's no stress from the harmful use of animals, there's no need to stop. You can just keep on practicing until you've really learned, until you've gained the confidence and the competence to go on to the next level of the education. Because within the faculty, the department, the course, you have practical classes which are designed or meant to be designed to be meeting a range of different teaching objectives. And this is one example of one of the tools that can be used in order to meet those objectives effectively. And being able to learn from your mistakes in an environment that doesn't have the ethical stress or the injury to the animal is a very important way for students to learn, as well as the impact, of course, on the animal that's not being used harmfully. There's also other mannequins and simulators. This is the POP trainer, Pulsating Organ Perfusion trainer. This was developed at a hospital in Austria for training in laparoscopy, or minimally invasive surgery. So a waste animal organ is put inside, it's perfused, there's a pump, And you can basically then, with your trocars, your instruments, the camera and the lights, you have some action. On the screen you'll see what you're doing within the trainer, which is a closed, clean system where you can practice and practice and practice. And I went to a training session in Austria where there were 6 or 8 of these apparatus set up for professional surgeons to be honing their skills, practicing different procedures and trying out different instruments, different new instruments. So this is a very effective way, and has now, according to the developers and some of the surgeons, become a bit of a gold standard in terms of how surgeons can train and train effectively. There's also a wide range of different synthetic materials, organs and organ systems where you can actually also practice laparoscopic procedures on as well. And if you really want an even more creative approach, innovative approach, you can also animate human and animal cadavers. So real cadavers that are specially preserved and prepared, and through which there's the perfusion of a synthetic blood, a pump, and you can then practice a wide range of different procedures, from basic incisions to specific things like the creation of an artificial aneurysm, management of bleeding and so on. And there's a Syrian neurosurgeon who works at the University of Arkansas who's developed his name is Emad Aboud, Dr. Emad Aboud. He's developed Emad's live cadaver model, and you can find out more information on our website about that. And he argues now that for neurosurgery and general surgery, there is now no need whatsoever for animal experiments within surgery. So this is and along with the pop trainer, are very good replacements for the use of pigs, for example, in surgical procedures. Okay. Within human medicine, there are even more advanced mannequins, I should add, with synthetic organs, and often the situations of the simulated clinics are so realistic that the trainee surgeons will get quite upset if they manage to fail to keep the virtual patient alive. So it's very realistic. Okay, multimedia, another type of alternative. There's 3 types of multimedia. There's the virtual anatomy program, where you can do a virtual dissection, looking at different levels of dissection, having labels, comparing between species, looking at different magnification, gross anatomy, histology, and so on. This is also, you can also have very high quality colour images with a lot of labelling, but bringing together hundreds, if not thousands, of high quality colour images and labels in order to learn anatomy in a very effective way. This is the virtual laboratory. This is where you have a simplified laboratory dedicated to learning certain principles, and virtual labs are very good for correlating multiple and simultaneous events. So it's very good for physiology and pharmacology classes for students. And you can look at classic nerve conduction velocity experiment, set all the parameters and get a result. Now, these are all set within a program. There's algorithms or old data that are being used in order to present the results. But there's also virtual reality, which is a much more immersive and sensory experience, generally rooted more in advanced level training within human medicine. There's some VR within veterinary medicine as well. And it's generally developed where there's more money. So, for example, the US has been very much behind developing virtual reality for training. And another reason for the US being very much behind that, as well as the money, is that it's a very litigious culture. If you make a mistake as a surgeon in the US, you're quite likely to be taken to court and have your career put on hold at least. So it's very important to ensure high quality, effective training, and virtual reality can do that. And I'm going to show you just a quick clip of a VR operation. So this is a recording of a real-time simulation. Okay, so can we turn off these lights actually? It'd be really useful if they were off. We can't see so much. Just the front ones will be fine. Yeah, that's fine. A bit better. You can close this. Okay. Yeah, be nice. Okay, so what you're seeing here is what the surgeon would actually be doing. So they're standing here with a desk and the apparatus, and on the screen you see the virtual patient or the organs. So what you're seeing there is what I'm actually doing in real time. So I'm practicing the procedure in advance of doing the real procedure on the real patient. And I think the thought of pilots training without doing flight simulation would be a bit disturbing to most of us. We would expect them to practice on flight simulators first because of the practical and ethical constraints that you would face if you are practicing with customers, with passengers. So I think this is the same with human and veterinary surgeons as well. We need to train to the best degree possible using the most effective methods, and VR is one of those methods. Okay. There's also the simulation of the sense of touch, so you can wear special data gloves so that as you push the needle into the virtual patient or try to use the endoscope, you will actually feel the force feedback with your hands as well. So even computer simulation through virtual reality can be a hands-on experience as well. It's not just that you have to have a real animal or human in front of you. Computer simulation can also do that too. You don't need haptics for everything. It all depends on what you're specifically trying to learn, what the teaching objectives are within that specific simulation. Okay. Okay. So what happens when you really do need hands-on experience of animals and animal tissue itself? We argue for ethically sourced animal cadavers and tissue. Ethically sourced, according to our policy definition, is that the animals were free-living, died naturally or in accidents, or were euthanized for medical reasons, not practical or economic reasons, but only medical reasons. And if that's the case, for example, with cats and dogs donated into a body donation program, then you can get the cadavers that at least veterinary students will need for dissection and surgical dissection and other procedures in order to practice on. So again, it's not it's not correct that you need to kill an animal in order to get its cadaver, or that you need to do an animal experiment for surgery. Perhaps one of the ideal veterinary surgical scenarios would be first to work on models and mannequins, secondly to work on ethically sourced cadavers, and thirdly to be apprenticed into surgical practice with a professional supervision and professional surgeon. And those different alternatives together, because often we are talking about combinations of alternatives, can fully meet and indeed exceed the teaching objectives that you'd be trying to meet with animal experiments. Then there's a very good body donation program at Tufts University in Boston in the US, where all the small animal and increasingly the large animal cadaver requirements for anatomy, pathology, clinical skills and surgery are indeed met through a body donation program. This also helps link up the public with universities to build up trust concerning animal use, because it's a fully ethical use of animals and people can donate the remains of their companion animal into a system, and that creates a good atmosphere. Okay. Clinical work with animal patients and human patients is another type of alternative. Every vet and medical student will have access to work with patients, of course, as well. We would argue that actually they need to have much earlier access and much greater access, and that this is also an alternative to animal experimentation within surgery. And I think the clinic is a very good alternative approach. Not only can it bring about the replacement, but it's a much more realistic, less contrived environment. You see everything from meeting the client to the diagnosis, participation in the operation, the recovery, the post-operative care. That's a much broader lesson concerning what you're trying to learn as a future professional than doing an animal experiment. And of course it's healing, not harming, which is what medicine and veterinary medicine are meant to be all about. I think we also need to look at caring as a clinical skill. Sometimes animal ethics, animal welfare are just sort of tacked on to a course when they should be really essential. But caring is another thing which I think needs to be at the heart of training. It's an essential skill. If you care, you're more likely to spot adverse reactions, adverse unnatural or abnormal behaviour. You're more likely to make an effort for the operation. You're more likely to be up to date with information and to ensure recovery. So caring is actually an essential skill which needs to be not just ignored, but actually included in the centre, at the heart of the education. So you're more likely to diagnose and treat better. And when you use alternatives, this validates and supports this skill. Self-experimentation is another type of alternative. For example, this apparatus, the BioPack Student Lab, links up with a computer. You can do nerve conduction velocity experiments on yourself and get better results. You can do nerve and muscle, respiratory and exercise physiology, also some pharmacology experiments, drinking coffee, doing urine analysis, and so on. And all of these can be a replacement for animal experiments too. In vitro labs, the more students are familiar with in vitro technology, the more prepared they'll be for alternatives within research and testing. So I think this is also very important, using ethically sourced animal tissue and using human tissue. In some cases you can even directly replace the animal tissue with plant material. Cell respiration experiments typically use mitochondria from rat livers. You can use mitochondria from potatoes, turnips and beet, and it's a direct replacement. And finally, field studies, getting out of the lab into the field. Good for zoologists, certainly, seeing live anatomy, animals in their ecological context, but also good for some veterinary students as well. There's a lot of different studies that have been published on this issue. I'll just show you one because the title I think really explains a lot. Virtual reality training improves operating room performance. So this is the alternative, although for many teachers and trainers they just think of these as better teaching approaches, not necessarily an alternative. Improves operating room performance, and this is what we're aiming for, better training, to have better trained professionals. Okay, you can also go to our website where we have a studies database, and there you can see comparative studies and look at the implementation of alternatives and technology in education and training. But we also need to look at the hidden curriculum, the implicit lessons that are often negative, which teach, for example, the acceptability of instrumental use of animals. And alternatives can obviate or remove the negative hidden curriculum. A third myth is that teaching about animal welfare and animal ethics is consistent with animal experiments. No, I think that the potential benefits of teaching this is negated by animal experimentation, so they really need to go together. Another myth, alternatives are not the real thing and animal experiments are. This is confusing the method with the objective. Animal experiments is just one method. Not a very good one, I think, when you compare with the power of alternatives. But the real thing is actually the effective gaining of knowledge and skills. It might also mean that, assume that if you have no animal experiments, you have no animals or no learning tools. That's really not the case. We're talking about replacement of harm and may involve work with real animals as well. Next myth is that you always need a living animal. No, you'll come across a living animal in your career if that's what you want. The key thing is the best quality training. Okay, so when you introduce alternatives, you have better quality education. The studies suggest that. It's a better learning environment. Biology is the study of life. Medicine as healing, not harming, suggests that there's maybe an inconsistency with animal experimentation. Compassion and ethical, knowing the ethical terrain, ethical decision making are all very important skills and qualities within the professions and individually in society. We need to recognise this. And to recognise, I think, that desensitisation is a loss to the professions. And it's also a question of accessibility. Many students don't even go into the life sciences because they might expect dissection or animal experimentation. So you're excluding people just by that approach. Whereas alternatives, you don't have that problem. And there was an American student who won $95,000 in compensation because her freedom of conscience was denied when she asked for alternatives. So these are important civil liberties issues. Practically, okay, 2 minutes. Practically, the environment can benefit because you're not taking animals from the wild for zoology. If we can protect animal welfare and animal rights, I think we should. Economically, alternatives are usually cheaper. The most advanced VR might be more expensive, but generally they're cheaper. And you can also encourage local economic development by developing new alternatives. And you can get a better reputation as a teacher and a university, as well as the legislation. The new directive now includes education, and if alternatives are available, they should be used. and our experience is that they are available and possible to be used, feasible to be used in every case. Okay, I'm going to skip through this next few slides, but we provide information resources, website, libraries of alternatives, a grant programme, we support students who object, and we do conferences and outreach tours. I'll just very quickly go through this because the website is where you can access information about alternatives through our alternatives database with over 1,000 different products. These are individual products which you can then click on to find out more information. We also have a studies database where you can look at references and full abstracts and increasingly full PDFs of whole papers in order to look at the topic. So this is another database, and we're developing a downloads database for downloading alternatives and other material like speeches as well at the moment. Okay, so that's the end of the resources. So just to conclude, there's very many different types of alternatives, and they exist for every class. We believe 100% replacement of harmful animal use is possible, and there are many resources to support that. And there's growing momentum and success. I was recently at a new Mexican veterinary college, which is alternatives only. I just come back from India, where dissection zoology has now been dropped, and up to 50 million animals will be saved from being killed every year as a result. And it's a win-win solution. Students have access to best practice learning tools. Teachers can pass on their knowledge and skills more effectively. The professions and society win because better trained people will be entering them, and of course the animals win as well. So what we're talking about is ethical and effective acquisition of knowledge and skills in life science, education and training. And this anticipates and supports alternatives in research and testing because it's an essential part of the training for science as well. So we recommend a ban, this is the second conclusion, recommend a ban on secondary level animal use. We think that's not necessary. At the moment it's voluntary in the UK, but we think it should be banned. Animals that are killed for dissection are not included in the statistics for procedures, therefore we get a distorted view of animal use in education, so that should be changed as well. We need to think about redefining alternatives, as I described earlier, invest and promote alternatives in general, and develop them also for lab animal training, even though we don't support lab animal work in research and testing either. Until the law catches up with the science and the potential with the technology, I think virtual reality alternatives, as well as some clinical learning opportunities, could be a very good alternative within laboratory animal training as well. And we think therefore that ethics committees should refuse permission for any harmful animal use within education and training. So thank you very much for listening.